Hello and welcome. My name is Witty G, and today we are going to be chatting about something a little different and a bit more serious, and that's voting. This won't be some video begging you to vote and trying to rightfully convince you that if you don't get out there and exercise your right, you're leaving it up to others to dictate the rules that will apply to your life. Nor will this be a video talking about all the amazing political campaign ads. Maybe another time.
Utah District 12, listen up right here. There's a new name on the ballot for the Senate this year.
What this video will be discussing is that storyboard I showed moments ago. What does it mean? Who it discusses? Possible solutions for the problem I was attempting to portray visually, and more importantly, the history of the dilemma. Which is why I decided to wear this, Hollister thing, because this is a serious matter. Dressing properly for the occasion is half the battle.
I guess half the battle.
But first, let's get into some context.
The state of Florida has charged and is in the process of arresting 20 individuals across the state for voter fraud.
Apparently, I guess you have a warrant?
For what?
I'm not sure.
For voter stuff, man.
For voters.
It's what it is. I think the agents with FDLE talked to you last week about some voter fraud, voter stuff, when you weren't supposed to be voting, maybe.
I didn't.
So,
What are they talking about?
that's
man?
what we're not the case agents, but what you got to do, they have reduced your bond quite a bit. It's 2 felony charges for voter fraud, but they've reduced it to $500 bonds. So it's $1,000 total.
Oh my God, man! What
So, yes, sir. So unfortunately, right now we're gonna have to take you to jail, but you got a bond right away. You don't have to go to first appearance, nothing like that. So
a bond? I didn't do. What did I do wrong?
So, ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest.
For what?
For voter fraud.
Good, how are you, sir?
Right?
I was.
Boss, how's it going?
Oh my God! Hold on.
Wait.
Let me tell my husband.
We're telling him, he's right here.
Right here. So if you can put your hands behind your back, please.
Oh my God!
Do
So,
not move.
ultimately, ma'am, you have a warrant? Okay. The warrant. Hold on, listen. I know you caught off guard, I understand. Right? So you have a warrant, it's for voter fraud, okay? Hear me out. It's an ROR. You know what an ROR is?
Oh my God!
You go in, you get booked, and then they're going to release you from booking.
You can go right out.
You're going to be right back out. Okay?
Right back
But you
out.
have a warrant.
Yes, sir. I'm at the right house, and I have the right man. The sheriffs want to talk to you, sir.
Well, they said they were coming over here.
Okay.
Well, can I please go hang up my phone?
Okay, well, I'll hang it up for you. We'll take a walk back and in. I'll hang it up for you. All right.
What's this for about?
They just want to talk to you. I have to detain you until they get here. That's my instructions. So.
19 convicted felons were arrested in the Sunshine Retirement State for the crime of voter fraud. Somehow, the whole situation was stirred up by confusion. This all stems from Amendment 4, which restored all felons their rights to vote, except for those convicted of sexual crimes or murder charges. However, due to the haphazard procedures in Florida, some of the people convicted of these felonies were still given paperwork to register to vote. They were avidly told to go out and vote, and that if they aren't supposed to, the system would work itself out. And so, it did. In a frightening way. Now, these 19 individuals are being accused of voter fraud, threatened with possible jail time, fines, additional felonies on their record, and being publicly arrested in front of their families. It's a traumatic and befuddling sequence as even the police arresting them are confused about the situation. Governor DeSantis is claiming fraud when the clear problem is with the system. I would even argue the problem is with the hurdles and obstacles stopping all American citizens from voting, particularly those with a felony on their record. But more importantly, how did we get here? How do we end up with 19 people being told by the government they can vote, even given the paperwork, but now they have the potential of ending up with 5 years in prison and $5,000 worth of fines? So, this got me thinking, wait, do prisoners or people formerly incarcerated with a felony even have the right to vote? Not something I usually think about because I'm not in prison. It's not my problem. I'm sure most of you feel the same because you probably aren't in that predicament as well. But there's still people, and seeing these people in the footage from Florida in such vulnerable and compromising positions was heartbreaking. At the least, it made me curious about the incarcerated and previously incarcerated's right to vote. Why was this such a big deal? You know, because aside from the whole cacophony of the situation, this Amendment 4 is pretty huge. It's amazing that we are granting pivotal rights back to these people, but at the same time, it's also less than the bare minimum, in my opinion. I think all American citizens, regardless of what they did, should have the right to vote. It's a civic duty, as so many politicians say, and it's one of the core values of being an American. The eradication of that right feels in itself un-American for a state founded on democracy, the rights, and the voice of the people. So, let's start from the beginning. Felony disenfranchisement starts with English colonists practicing a technique in common law called civil death. What this did was it limited the promise of voting rights to offenses related to voting or violations of their moral code. But then, after the American Revolution, that punishment was changed to encompass all felony offenses. Also, there was a restriction of voting based on race, gender, and class at this time. So let's not forget about that disenfranchisement. During the Jim Crow era, with more free black people walking the street, especially in the South, law enforcement had a new target in sight. This is evident by the structure of laws such as black codes. This could include small stuff like vagrancy or standing around for too long in a place people didn't want you, or being black in public. Literally, if law enforcement or enough racist white people found you threatening in the South, you could almost certainly find yourself in prison. So, now you're in prison, you have a felony on your record, which means you no longer had the right to vote. Awesome. All this because some racist motherfucker didn't like you and called the police. Where have we seen something like this before?
I'm gonna tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
This is also around the time where we get the 14th Amendment in 1868, which in theory ended prejudice by stating all American citizens are equal to one another in the face of the law. It also reads that the state can't take American rights from the people, including voting, unless they are involved in an insurrection or commit a federal crime. It was not until a century later with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that brought some real equality, in theory. Even colored people were now allowed to vote, and with that drastic change, they were met with violence, threats, extra poll taxes, and unnecessary tests to stop them from voting. They also still stopped felons from voting. And once again, primarily black individuals due to rampant racism of both the police system and the South. And don't get it wrong, the North was also racist, just not as overtly. So we could see people who were arrested during the zenith of black code law enforcement out on the street once again and unable to vote because of the felony on their record. That means they aren't able to use their voice to help shape the world around them through the leaders elected. That chance was snuffed from them through the enforcement of Jim Crow law enforcement and a corrupted police department that was birthed out of the practice and tradition of hunting down slaves. What we see in the brief excerpts of history is a restriction of voting utilized as a tool of control, not just for those who commit an atrocity against the community, but for those who in being themselves are seen as an atrocity to the community. A tool used by those in power to keep the oppressed people's voices quiet. I feel that is what is happening now in our prison systems, and more importantly to those who are let out of the prison systems and have a felony on their record. This is even enacted through legislation like Amendment 4 and the state-by-state ruling on the formerly incarcerated's right to vote. Voting for all people has gotten largely better, with it being solidified as a right for all American citizens, but often left out of this sentiment are the incarcerated. This isn't addressed on a federal level, but largely state to state. Each of them handles the treatment of the previously incarcerated's voting availability. Studies show that the District of Columbia, Maine, and Vermont allow all their citizens to retain their right to vote, while majority of the states fall under this category, where voters who have a felony on their record lose the right while they're in prison, and is restored automatically after being released, like magic. Another good portion do this. Voters lose this privilege until after their parole and/or probation is completed, and it is automatically restored. And these guys, including Florida, do this. A voter with a felony will lose the right to vote until their sentence is complete, fines are paid, parole is finished, or basically any other hoops the state wants them to jump through to show that they're a good citizen now. As we see, there's no national plan for this. Everyone is kind of doing their own thing, or within a niche. One of the most problematic categories is the last one, in my opinion. Amendment 4 is a prominent example of how this arbitrary way of limiting the voices of the formerly incarcerated just aims to strip some of the most marginalized demographics of their voice. Because this legislation passed in Florida was not as cut and dry as I mentioned before. While at first first, it was created to make voting easier for citizens with a felony. It was later updated that they would have to finish parole and any fines they had as a prerequisite for this right, making it seem like these people had to jump through several more hoops to get a basic right most US citizens have. I get it, these people committed a crime, that's very bad and all crimes are equal, and all crimes deserve the death penalty. But seriously, after going through the mortifying process of prison and going through the difficulties of life on the outside as a previously imprisoned person with a felony on your record, you would think a person would have earned their rights as a standard US citizen again. Some of these difficulties after prison include limited employment, which means limited money, which means you can't pay your fines or other dues, which can lead to depression or accentuate already existing mental illness, and that can lead to making money in other illegal ways. And next thing you know, you're back in prison as a statistic who has to do this whole cycle all over again. It's not impossible to get your life together after prison, but it sure is hard. I think the least we should do is restore the right to vote to those people. A Pew Research paper discussing voting in prison shares a quote from Marlena Jens, the first assistant executive director for the Cook County Jail. She says, "If we're going to have a significant role in returning individuals to our communities as stronger citizens, there's no better way to do that than voting." If after leaving prison, the goal is to reassimilate a former criminal into American society, voting and making sure they know their voice holds importance in the democratic process because they're American is one of the first steps. It's not like they would be able to change the whole system alone with one vote. But perhaps that is what the people in power and those who shiver in fear at the thought of a prisoner's right to vote are afraid of. Let's take a look at the majority of the prison population. 48% are black or Latino, 2% Asian or Native American, and there are white people too. This is according to the Sentencing Project, and these stats came back from all the way in 2017. Let's look at something a little bit more accurate to today. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2022, black people take up 38.4%, white people 57.6%, Asian people 1.5%, indigenous people with 2.6%, and Latino people are not counted for some reason. I found a little article about this that I'll be linking in the description. If you're curious about it, give it a read. I found it really interesting and kind of fucked up. With these statistics, let's look at political leanings in the most generic sense. Colored people have historically tended to vote more for democratic values as opposed to Republican ones, which is why there was such a fear of black people back in the day coming out to vote, because the people holding undemocratic values tend to also be the racist ones. We also know that poor people tend to skew towards voting democratically as well, and often those put into incarceration are the poor. That's not to say all poor people vote for Democrats, because that surely is not true, but largely that is the case. We can say that the majority of the prison population are most likely poor people of color, and if not that, just poor. Democrats also tend to have more poor people's interests at heart, at least in terms of legislation, such as welfare and food stamps and social security. We have the majority of the prison population and those with felonies after incarceration to be poor, often people of color. And now, we have a good handful of states that have taken the valuable voices and votes of those people and shut them away because of a felony. The victims of the long arm of the law, as well as their own actions. Some of them were much younger and unwise during their criminal deed. And I won't say that everyone that comes out of prison is reformed, because prison isn't a place for reformation. But I will say that anyone who gets out of prison have served their time according to the law, and they should be granted the same rights of a standard US citizen, at least in terms of voting. It's not like those people can legalize crime. Why are we arbitrarily taking this right away and making people jump through such hurdles to get it back? The answer is that it affects people who the states deem not important enough, through their legislation and through their actions. It is the poor, and often poor people of color, who don't get a say in how their states run due to this disenfranchisement. Well, it turns out it's not as bad as I first thought it was. There are actually methods to vote in prison, believe it or not. The sentencingproject.org reads, in local jails, the vast majority of persons are eligible to vote because they are not currently serving a sentence for a felony conviction. Despite the fact that most persons detained in jail are eligible to vote, very few actually do. Jail administrators often lack knowledge about voting laws, and bureaucratic obstacles to establishing a voting process within institutions contribute significantly to limited voter participation. Indeed, acquiring voter registration forms or an absentee ballot while incarcerated is challenging when someone cannot use the internet or easily contact the Board of Elections in their community. In addition, Many persons in jail do not know they maintain the right to vote while incarcerated, and there are very few programs to guarantee voting access. It's also a jail, it's not really a place that's associated with freedom, so thinking you have the right to vote in this place seems like a work of fiction. Back on that Pew Research paper, it shares a quote from Brian Harrington, 29, who was released from prison in Illinois last April after 13 years of incarceration. He says, "Misinformation around voting rights is rampant among people in the criminal justice system. Some people awaiting trial in county jails wrongly assume they can't vote, while others in prison incorrectly think they'll never have the right to vote after they are released." The article from the Sentencing Project discusses several different states and their measures for protecting the rights of those in prison. Taking a look at PA, the history of voting inside Philadelphia's jails dates back to at least 2002, when the warden established a voter registration initiative in one of the jail facilities. The Jewish Employment and Vocational Services, or the JEVS, worked with the warden to establish the voter registration effort. JEVS was a community partner that administrated other programs at the jails, including computer training, welding, and horticulture. Key practices that standardized jail voting efforts included designating correctional staff responsible for jail voting education and registration. Current practices in the jail system include voter education for detained prisoners through public service announcements shown on closed-circuit television. Social workers also visit cell blocks to distribute voter registration and absentee ballot information. We see in Wisconsin a variety of advocacy groups including All Voting is Local, League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and the American Civil Liberties Union of Wisconsin. They teamed up and submitted records requests to each of the state's 72 county sheriffs earlier this year. The group found out that just over half the sheriffs said they had policies in place to encourage jail-based voting. For many incarcerated people, the group found several hurdles, including the state's voter ID law. The Badger State does not permit a jail ID as an acceptable form of identification to vote. People in jail who want to register to vote or request an absentee ballot must ask corrections personnel to make a copy of their confiscated driver's license or other state-issued ID. Still, with the help of local election officials and voting rights group, Riverstall has hosted 2 voter registration drives. Sitting behind a plexiglass and barred barrier in the visitors area, volunteers and election officials have registered more than a dozen new voters, sliding important documents through small slits in the divider and speaking through a closed-circuit telephone. After getting a records request from Wisconsin voting rights groups last year, Captain Dave Riverstall, the jail administrator of the Eau Claire County Sheriff's Office, so sorry if I messed that up, they found that his 418-bed jail did not have voting policies. As an Army veteran who served overseas in Kosovo, he said he knows the values of the democratic process in defending constitutional rights. But he said the state's laws presented serious challenges. Because Wisconsin's elections are administered at the city level to offer in-person voting, Riverstall would have to invite workers from the county's 18 towns to the jail, so it made sense to limit the voting to absentee by mail. The major thing with all the facilities with voting available to prisoners is the heavy presence and the impact of advocacy groups, as well as the collaboration with the prison system. Shawntae Nelson, the Wisconsin State Director for All Voting is Local, said, "This is the responsibility of the county jails, as well as election officials, administrators, and the legislature. We have to work collaboratively." Nelson is right. It's the job of the county jails and their staff to facilitate this with the politician and advocacy groups. Because advocacy groups are there. They're ready and they're there to help. But there is a ton of paperwork and logistics around this that make this whole issue so problematic for prisoners who are just trying to exercise their right to vote. Not to mention how scary the idea of a prisoner voting sounds at face value. To any person not really thinking, they imagine Ted Bundy legalizing the murder of girls around the country when that is a far cry from what happens. It's an easy topic to condemn because of the stigma around felons, prisoners, and even black people. Because for some people, just as easily as they imagine Ted Bundy legalizing murder, they could see a black criminal legalizing marijuana and murder on the same ballot.
Smoke weed every day.
Listen to this argument one lawmaker had. Inspired by the efforts in Illinois, local officials and advocacy groups are working to expand voter access to incarcerated residents. The Harris County Commissioner's Court authorized a proposal to place a polling place in the county's jail in 2019. The county, however, has not implemented this measure yet due to objections made by the county clerk, Diane Trotman. Trautman raised several obstacles that she claimed barred her from establishing a polling location at the jail, including incarcerated residents' lack of identification necessary to cast ballots in the county's jail, and the county's jail's lack of internet access, which would complicate the duties of the election workers. She also insists that any polling place, including one at a jail, would be required to be open to the public at large, meaning the general public must be able to enter the jail and have access to the proposed polling location for voting purposes. Trautman also suggested that creating a polling place in jail would risk violating the rights of the public because jail security would bar them from a polling place they should be entitled to enter. What a silly argument, as if people are going to want to come down to the jail just to submit their ballots. People barely want to go to the jail to visit their friends and family. However, the Campaign Legal Center and demos countered Trautman's objection by asserting that the state and county have an obligation to accommodate the voting rights of the incarcerated residents, and then suggested accommodations. For example, to overcome the lack of identification among jail voters, the clerk's office could accept inmate identification. They could change the rules because they made up the rules to stop these people from voting. So we could adjust them to make it easier, but the reason they aren't is because these people are less important. So yeah, we see them strike back by putting the responsibility back on people with power, and they're right. There are so many small errors, like the process of identification, that bring the accessibility of voting to prisoners down substantially. Clearly, we're not working in a system that is avidly trying to make voting for prisoners easier. This is clear to understand when we already have measures marked against people today that make it hard to vote, such as gerrymandering and the modern, often mundane voter suppression laws. Not to mention not making voting a national holiday or extending the time for votes to be accepted, or how much of a fuss particular people are making over mail-in ballots despite being a pivotal part of our democracy. So, with all this subterfuge and literal attempts to hinder people from voting, it's no surprise that most prisoners don't know about this right to vote. I know I didn't before I read this. So now we know most people in prison can vote, but things get a little bit more complicated once you leave prison with a felony on your record. As mentioned, your privilege to vote is dictated on a state-by-state basis. It will come down to a few options. Either you never lose your right to vote, like in these goated states, you will lose it while you're in jail, and get it right back after the completion of your sentence. You lose it while on parole/probation, and once that's over you can have it back. Or you can lose it until after probation and you need a pardon, like in Wyoming. Or if you do an infamous crime, you can't get it back, like in Tennessee.
From Tennessee, because you're the only 10 I see. Like one
It
of
was
those.
worse. It was like
Or after probation and after paying all your fines, like in Florida. So I think, like the states, all of us have varying opinions on what should happen to these people. Quite frankly, I'm not going to try long to convince you differently. I'm just going to reiterate my points and let you know where I stand and let you decide what you might think. I believe you should never lose your right to vote, obviously. But if I was to pick one of these options other than the goated states, I would go with the one that says once your sentence is finished, you get your rights reinstated automatically. It's bizarre to find that there are such limitations on this process. Despite the idea that prison represents, it's theoretically supposed to be a place where a person goes inside and is changed for the better through strict punishment and borderline torture. Yet, when they leave, they still can't be granted full citizens' rights until payment or parole is completed. A lot of the time, this stipulation is for heinous actions like murder or theft. Even theft? Why are we equating theft with murder and other things? There are also levels to murders in this justice system. Context is very important. Why are we applying a blanket rule of restricted voting to citizens because of a crime listed on their record? That seems to undermine the success of the reformation in the prison industrial complex, overcomplicate things, and rely on third parties to grant pardons in their spare time. All for a punishment that doesn't have anything to really do with their crime. These are big states with big cities that are full of prisoners who have histories of doing various heinous and not so heinous things. So I can imagine the stress and overwhelming nature of the paperwork alone that would go into checking to see who and who wasn't screwed over by the law, and a tired and overworked public defender, and a police system who was just trying to book someone. There are so many elements that need to be examined to see who is worthy of a pardon or able to have the right to vote reinstated. Hopefully, these things get mentioned in the pardon request of the person who is now disenfranchised since to their governor. Except pardons are not often the highlight of a governor's run, and are the things they save for last. Meaning, if their story wasn't compelling enough to get to the governor's kind heart, or they aren't dedicated to their community enough, then they will find themselves waiting till the next governor notices them. And if not them, the next, and the next, and then the next, the next. All as the world changes around them, sometimes for the better, more often than not for the worse, and then they can do nothing about it. It almost feels like a prison. Like you can only do the necessary actions to survive, serving at a job that pays minimum wage, has awful benefits and work environment, but it's only one you can get because you're an ex-felon. That title is synonymous with some sort of disease that makes you detestable to employers. You're a liability, especially when there are countless other workers without that blemish. Luckily, you can make enough to eat, you can live somewhere, and survive. Hopefully, you have it better off than others. If you have a family to take care of, if you made your bad decision to commit a crime amidst the pursuit of your version of the American dream, then this journey to support yourself, you and yours, has gotten that much harder. I'm depressed just thinking about it. I can't imagine living it. This is why having a blanket rule that all prisoners retain their right to vote gets rid of that tedious process. Just say that prisoners are less than citizens. All of them, regardless of their crime. Or at least the poor ones who can't buy their way back into a normal life. Because that's all this is stated through the roundabout ways that formerly incarcerated felons have to navigate this process. Groveling to the governor for a pardon, having to scrounge up leftover money in a crumbling economy to pay off fines, and not having the proper government offices to handle this mass number of disenfranchised Americans are all evidence of a country that doesn't care for these people's voices. Time and time again, votes are equated to your voice. It's your way of pushing for change. It's your way of crying out for help from a system that allows it. Yet the country leaves about 5 million people disenfranchised because of a felon. What the fuck does your right to vote have to do with your crime? Whether it was wiretapping, poisoning, murdering, or robbing, what does that have to do with a vote? All these measures is a form of control for the masses, the mass number of individuals who are victims of the prison industrial complex, the broken law system, the shadiness of our police officers in the court, and the violence of them outside of the courtroom. Long story short, I think it's stupid to have these rules to stop people from voting. So, things look semi-bleak for prisoners and the previously incarcerated around the country in terms of suffrage, but got some good news, guys. Thanks to advocacy groups like the Jewish Employment and Vocational Services, the ACLU of Southern California, All Voting is Local, League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and even the Prison Fellowship, where I got some of my statistical and historical info from. They are making a change. All of these programs are working to make this right more and more available than ever to those afflicted by the criminal justice system. Big legislation like these have passed as well. In 2021, Connecticut, New York, Washington, and California passed numerous bills restoring voting rights to citizens on parole. The Sentencing Project states since 1997, 25 states have modified felony disenfranchisement provisions to expand voter eligibility and or inform persons with felony convictions of their voting rights either through legislative or executive actions. Millions of justice-involved residents have regained the right to vote because of these reforms. We have even seen law enforcement be a direct ambassador of suffrage on prisoners' behalf with Dave Raristow, who says, "The people in jail are the people in the community. Voting is an important life skill that needs to be utilized whether someone is in jail or out of custody. If you are eligible and want to vote, jail has the resources and support to make that happen." This support from lawmakers and prison leadership needs to be extended to those in prison as well as ex-prisoners. So, with all the hurdles the disenfranchised in Florida have to go through in order to even be allowed to vote, fusion of the procedures from both the victims and the law enforcement, and Ron DeSantis stated this is some huge fraud instead of some awful clerical error. DeSantis described the whole incident this way at a rally. Yet, they went ahead and voted anyway. This is against the law, and now they're going to pay the price for it, clearly demonizing them and tapping into that fear that a murderer may have the right to vote, almost grasp it. Now we have to punish them severely for trying to steal our democracy away, clearly tapping into the very false fear of voter fraud, something that more than 40% of Trump's base believes, according to this article from whenever. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more now. The brain rot just keeps getting worse. It just keeps surging. Who knows if DeSantis is causing all this uproar because he hates criminals, because he wants to push this narrative of voter fraud for his Republican besties. Or maybe that's just how he plans on winning when he inevitably abandons Florida to pursue the presidency.
Will you serve a full 4-year term if you're reelected governor of Florida? It's not a tough question.
The governor didn't speak, and when he did, he fired back.
The only worn-out old donkey I'm looking to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist.
The moment is viewed by some as a confirmation that DeSantis, at least, is considering a run for the presidency.
Either way, it all feels like a tactic to not only make voting in Florida harder for people who have a felony, but also act as a rallying cry that imaginary voter fraud is occurring. So, with some of the background of this event discussed, I'd like to go back to the art and just show you some of the little bitty details I added. The numbers on the jumpsuit are representative of Amendment 4 in Florida, as well as the 14th Amendment in our Constitution. Pathway to freedom is misty because there's no real guidebook to that, I assume. I also laid some ladies of justice around to kind of push that theme of injustice or whatever, just more symbolism for the justice system, honestly. Once again, the mist is added because there are no real instructions on life after lockup. You just gotta figure it out. The mist is also there to add as a distraction from the many others suffering from what you suffer. Prison teaches two major lessons: how to bond with others for survival, and how to isolate from others for survival. You have to find yourself in a gang, or else you risk no protection from the violence you're sure to encounter during your stay. Who knows what that gang will have you do or witness. You are also informed to stay away from certain groups. For instance, if you're black, you do not want to mess with the Aryan Brotherhood. I assume this goes vice versa. And you probably don't want to mess with a rival black gang, or anyone who looks remotely violent in that place, or non-violent. Don't talk to anyone in prison. I'm sure each prison is different, but isolation is a core tactic of how these places work and how they try to break people. They try to devolve human beings into this caveman mindset where they have to rely on violence and dastardly tactics for survival. Not to mention, it's already a volatile environment filled with people of various ages and backgrounds. 18-year-olds are placed with 40-year-olds and older. The mentally ill can be placed with the easily agitated and volatile. In a place that is supposed to represent strict rules and regulation, it is a breeding ground for some of the darkest and most depraved moments of mankind. All that to say that when you come out, you can feel alone. You can feel out of place. You can feel isolated while around people. You aren't talking about your feelings in prison usually, so you can also find yourself shutting off and not recognizing that there are so many others who are in the exact same shoes as you, who are struggling with those exact same anxieties, awful thoughts, and isolated mentality. The mist also represents that separation, exiling each prisoner to their own regulated track of fate, unaware of the equal torment their fellow former felon is under. The parole officer has a change in his writing on his face and becomes unemployment, depression, and crime. These are often the hurdles former felons can find to stop their progression as free citizens. As mentioned before, it is so hard to find employment as a felon. That leads to depression or accentuates mental illness already there. And then the best way to get money is the illegal way, the way that will pay the bills substantially and quickly. All this can culminate to life back in prison, back on the cycle, back having to fight your demons again in there. Years have passed and finally we see the prisoner break out of his jail clothes and be free. This is supposed to be him breaking free from the stigma of being a criminal upon the first sight, due to community service and reshaping his public persona. Now we see the scissors and the invitation to the free voice. Obviously, this is referring to Amendment 4. This demon politician calls in a favor, and we all know how it ends. That's all the subtext. So, you're probably wondering how we fix this issue. This seems like super hard, and if only there were really experienced people in this topic who had already curated solutions to this very complex problem. Boom! There were some really good ones on the Sentencing Project site, because nothing I'm saying is new. All this stuff is known. The advocacy groups, the prisons, the politicians, they all know, but prisoners aren't important enough to care about as people. The only people who are really caring about them are the advocacy groups. And let alone those who commit felonies. Hell, black and brown people literally have to make a movement saying their lives matter, and racists still come out with the opposite slogan of that and act like it doesn't mean the opposite. It's word games and logistics. Just like legislation made to make voting in prisons harder and voting as a person with a felony nearly impossible in some states. We need national legislation, we need national change, so we're all on the same page. Instead of having this handle on a state-by-state basis, which only serves to complicate an already complicated system, with an already complex life being a free person with a felony. At the very least, we need places where this info is readily supplied to formerly imprisoned people with felonies on their record, and those who are already incarcerated or currently incarcerated. Look at some of these easy fucking ideas to make voting in prison simpler. Put polling places in jail, right? Like obvious. We should be doing that. Yeah. Make the sheriffs make voter registration and ballot access easy for the people in prison. Some states require county officials to submit plans ensuring voter registration efforts and ballot access for incarcerated residents. The Colorado Secretary of State adopted a rule covering this practice for the state's 64 counties, and a similar rule was adopted in Arizona. Next, we have give a different status to prison votes to ensure they get delivered. Since there's a lot of controversy around prison voting, not to mention around voting in general, there's a lot of people who don't want you to vote or just don't want your votes to really matter or count. Massachusetts grants special voter protection status to incarcerated residents. The status ensures the ability to register and participate in the electoral process. Next, we have give the community and the sheriff the chance to work together. Organizers in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. support designating voter coordination responsibilities to jail or local election staff. Designated staff can coordinate voter education materials and absentee voter efforts and serve as a community liaison to partner with civic organizations. Strengthening voting in jail practices ensure electoral participation for residents most at risk of being disenfranchised. The adoption of state and local policies helps momentum for reform. This report documents efforts to protect the voting rights of justice-involved residents and offers policy and practice measures for stakeholders to adopt. These solutions can be achieved through various mechanisms, including legislative reform, local actions, and civic group leadership. Super easy, super basic. If you had 3 minutes to come up with ways to make voting in prison better, you could have come up with this. And for giving felons the right to vote, I don't know. How would someone fix that? I don't know.
Maybe make it that you never take it away. Maybe make it that they always keep the right to vote.
Because unless they do a crime that involves votes, like tampering with votes, or an insurrection where we're trying to like stop a vote, or the complete, you should be punish people in relation to their punishment or in relation to their crime. Punish them in relation to the crime. But if just like not taking the right to vote from prisoners is like too radical, that's like too leftist, that's too crazy, if that's too much for you, just give it to them after prison automatically. Like if you serve your time in prison, you should automatically be able to vote. I mean, people are allowed to vote. People are allowed to vote in prison even if they like commit a felony. That's what we read earlier, right? Please, if I'm wrong about this, please correct me. But I think that they say that if you have a felony on your record, you're still allowed to vote because you technically haven't left prison and have that felony on your record. So if you're in prison and you murdered like a ton of people and you asked to vote and like they have the system there for you to vote, you could do it. That's what they're saying, which is dumb. This is all so dumb when we can make it easier. And it all just goes to say that they don't care. They just don't care about you if you get out of prison. And I wish that they would just say that instead of acting like they do and making these dumb rules for people to go through. Just say, just say it. So one, I want to say thank you for making it this far. I appreciate you a ton. Two, I hope that this has slightly or hopefully majorly changed your perception of criminals and the formerly incarcerated. They are not all caricatures and cartoons. In fact, they're real people with real struggles. I'd hope this was common sense, but some people are raised with this bias. Sometimes it's not their fault, it's just the way they were brought up. Other times it's purposeful. It's a means of dehumanizing a person, boiling them down to just a sin or a wicked act, which is never the correct thing to do. People are three-dimensional pieces of shit. Thirdly, I hope I convince you that the punishment of taking away the right to vote from the formerly incarcerated isn't some profound homage to our founding fathers or the Constitution. It's an incredibly complicated and context-based issue that is handled on a state-by-state basis. that does nothing to ensure that the prison system works in reforming those who are incarcerated to fully fledged American citizens once again, but does arbitrarily place barriers for those convicted of felonies, while purposefully silencing the voices of some of the most oppressed and vulnerable people in the United States. That incident in Florida was a travesty and an infuriating and humiliating video to watch, as those people who had served their time were now being arrested in front of their families and communities. Though these situations will most likely be sorted out, as we see in this ABC article in which the felony was dropped and so were the fines, it's the fact that this happened, and DeSantis is using this embarrassing and anxiety-inducing incident as a rallying cry for voter fraud in Florida, weaponizing them and their trauma and their mistakes. It's gross. One of the best things we can do is keep the discourse going around these topics of voter rights for the incarcerated and former felons, as well as the importance of voting holistically. There are so many people my age and older who feel disenfranchised, and we're not in jail. We just feel like whichever vote we put out, it won't have a substantial change, if any. The incarcerated probably feel this way even more so. We should be using this time to educate on the history and importance of voting, the sacrifice that has been made to force the government to give the people the right to vote, the right to use their voice, and using this time to bring about candidates who inspire voting, not just inspire the act of voting against an opponent. When we look at the history of disenfranchising, there's a transaction. The vulnerable majority in exchange for the success of the rich minority. Most of us can find common ground for anger here. Whether we be a woman who wasn't allowed to vote till women's suffrage was achieved in August 1920, whether we be a person of color who had our ancestors fight for the right to vote, which ended up in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the 19th century, when most states had gotten rid of the prerequisite of tax-paying and land ownership, allowing white males across the country to vote to their heart's content. When the Constitution was first crafted, this counted for only like 6% of the population, so getting rid of that barrier was seen as a phenomenal example of equality. So we as a country have a history of muting the voices of the oppressed for the success of the oppressor. There are a lot of things that have to change in our country before we even get close to handling the issue of getting people with felonies on their record a right to vote across all state lines. As mentioned before, black and brown people are still fighting against police brutality and blatant racism in the criminal justice system. And there's still a wage gap that is slowly closing. I'm assuming by the year 3300 we'll probably finally be equal. There's still people who believe the 2020 election was stolen, even though the guy who was saying this primarily admitted he was lying. We have a lot to fix in this country, but by bringing these issues to the forefront, we can at least talk about them and slowly break down the stigma we may already have about the vast majority of incarcerated people, or help others break that stigma. Because as the jail administrator, Captain Dave Raristol, says, the people in jail are the people in the community. Voting is an important life skill that needs to be utilized whether someone is in jail or out of custody. If you are eligible and want to vote, jail has the resources and support to make that happen. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Stay happy, stay healthy, and be kind to someone. See ya.